the linchpin for any and all of these origin debates: STC designs. Now, there's only one period where STC designs originate from, and it is definitely referenced that some areas of a hive city at the mid-level within a hive's spire structural space are designed to STC guidelines. Now, this can mean two things. Of course, it suggests to us that hive cities can be readily established well into the Dark Age of technology, as this was the period when we know STC designs were being produced, not before and not after, although, like I say, devil's advocate, this period is very unclear to us. On the other side of things, maybe it just means that they have found an STC in terms of building stuff and they're using it within a hive city. Although, I will note, as I've repeatedly said before now, I've only found a few references to this, not several, so again, take it with a pinch of salt. Still though, as I always say, references are certainly important, but so is context. And it seems fairly logical, doesn't it, that when placed in context, structures like hive cities would make good logical sense to have originated from a period where humanity was operating seemingly on a standardized template system across the galaxy. This would certainly help us also to explain why hive cities are so surprisingly widespread. It also makes sense when we consider the scant details we know from humanity's golden age, that in this time they existed at peak technological levels, which, even if we give the Imperium a fairly wide amount of leeway, I would argue it's very debatable that they would have the general knowledge to construct such vast towers all across the galaxy. We know that they can construct big machines like the Titans, they can create huge defenses, they can create ships that travel the galaxy, so they can create all this stuff. However, a lot of these things still have original origins to do with STC from the Dark Age of technology. So as I say, I just question whether or not they could do this on such a widespread scale. Whereas, on the other side of things, within the Golden Age, the concept of creating a correctly functioning arcology seems considerably plausible and also fits within their worldview of what we can estimate it to be anyway. It just seems more logical that that would be the case. Also, when you consider that many of these colonists arrived at worlds which would have, to my mind at least, initially wanted to concentrate their population to a large degree, because remember, these were not just a ramshackle bunch of frontier colonists looking to create the Wild West, trekking out to stake a claim on a piece of land. They were a very highly advanced population of humans, both ideologically and technologically, and were travelling to new worlds with the specific purpose of colonizing them. So splitting themselves up all across a planet seems a very unlikely choice for them. In fact, from what is speculated about humans in futurism, it's debatable if humans in the Golden Age would still have really even held concepts like individual private ownership for land and materials and so on. And so it may simply have been that working in collaboration with their STC system, which as we know appear very likely to have been a form of advanced AI, as well as, yes, being something akin to a 3D printer, automated production system, plus whatever other help humans had in this time in the form of the Stone and Golden Men, whatever they are, they had a lot of help, is what I'm saying basically. Now truthfully, we can't really know to what degree humans were actually involved in planning or even overall decision making in this early time. It may well have been that they just left this to their automated systems to decide, knowing that they would choose the most efficient and best intentioned plans for human comfort and safety. And this would also help to explain why hive cities are not commonly seen on, say, feudal worlds, which can also be known as the night worlds. Now at a very basic level, you could simply say, well, that's because hive cities are very technology based and feudal worlds aren't. Now sure, that is a very blatantly obvious conclusion to make, but it's also missing a very large part of the context. So just allow me another small tangent here. There was a period even during the Golden Age where some parts of humanity apparently started to decide to turn their backs and discard their reliance on AI and high tech over time. Not initially, over time. Now they were resorting then to a simpler way of life. This turned out to be quite the wise decision in the long term, and why many night feudal worlds escaped the worst of the Age of Strife, because many were able to survive fairly intact into the Age of the Imperium. However, despite their abandonment of technology, there was still a time where they had produced things likely according to STC designs, what are now known as Imperial Knights. So these defenders of the population would then seem to have been these high-ranking officials of their colony, but this eventually developed into the feudal system in the form of the noble families, because those piloting the powerful knight machines formed noble knight houses which exist even today in the Imperium. This was a result of their mental interfacing with the knight's machine spirit. But anyway, overall, this rejection of technology seems to be the most likely reason why in feudal worlds hive cities are not very common. If they do exist in any form, they're more like a basic state of development, probably having long been now adapted away from the type of high-tech and more resembling something I would liken to Mervyn Peake's classic creation of Gormenghast. Now, tangent within a tangent, go look up Gormenghast along with the novels Titus Grown and Titus Alone. For those of you on the Audible bandwagon, it's available there and it's about 5 hours each. Anyway, the point is that the fact that hive cities do not appear commonly on Knight and Feudal worlds but do appear widely on just about most other worlds of the Imperium, as I noted earlier, appearing as regularly as on 85% of Imperial worlds, this is not a figure that just occurs from random decision making in different places when such vast distances are involved between the worlds. Still, as I said before, I haven't decided exactly where I come down on this yet. It's very difficult to say when hive cities were widely constructed, but overall I would lean toward them being at least well in progress prior to the Age of Strife, because it seems quite clear that this was a widely adopted and planned design for a different era to me. And given that the vast majority of designs used by the Imperium are created from a similar origin, that being the STC products of the Dark Age, it stands to fair reason that hive cities also, and I want to emphasize this, at a basic level, are a product of AI STC design. And that although they now no longer operate by definition as a true arcology and have essentially rotted away over millennia to become a corpse-like travesty of their original glory, even in the described modern period within the Imperium, some cities on worlds will grow up so large as to become concentrated in huge urban sectors until they overlap as like a conurbation and then eventually begin to expand upward. This is described. But it's my estimation that the time prior to the Imperium is in fact more accurately the origin of hive cities, especially when we consider that some hive cities have been noted by the Mechanicus as being built from materials on their external surfaces that are unknown and unidentifiable to them. And this should lead us to conclude that the materials were constructed in a period where humanity had considerably more knowledge than now, because no Xenos would lend a hand in helping humans construct a city, so it can only have been from our distant past. And that, for me, is probably the real key there. It is a common tale within hive cities that their original foundings exist deep in the subsurface region, now known as the Underhive, and that the most ruined and crime-ridden sector of hive cities contain actually the deepest secrets of all. Taking expeditions, as I said before, into this section of a hive is very dangerous. Extremely violent places, often populated not just by the most brutal human elements, but also strange creatures, mutant tribes, and so on. There exists, though, the possibility that in a hive city's lowest levels, somewhere in the Imperium, may exist very important remnants, even technology, that tell us about the most ancient history of humanity. In knowing all this, it seems quite a tragedy that they would have at one time been beacons of human achievement, protected by a powerful godlike weaponry possessed by humanity during its zenith of the technological age. Who can now imagine just how these towering cities were meant to have appeared? Were they basic practical structures, or were they dressed in crystalline glass or some composite material to make them appear like true beacons of power and light and peak achievement? Not perhaps entirely unlike Eldar worlds during their age of glory before the fall. Hive cities were similarly once long ago undoubtedly a wonder to behold, a quite literal pinnacle of achievement. But now all that remains are the tattered, rotting corpse structures, symbolic of both what we once were and also where we find ourselves now. The disparity between the two should be greatly disturbing, but as so few people in the Imperium will ever know of the former glory of humanity, this is a comparison that few will ever be able to take the time to contemplate or consider. Now, the quite depressing downside to hive cities is that the area around many of them, as I noted earlier, will have been reduced to nothing more than what would appear to be an apocalyptic wasteland, devoid of even the smallest levels of biological life. These ashen wastelands surrounding hive cities are truly a tragedy to witness, having long ago suffered full ecological collapse, and perhaps for the entire planet itself. This is then compounded by many more millennia of pollution. They are chemically saturated lands, extremely hostile to any life itself. The composition of these ashen wastelands can vary significantly from planet to planet. There are those some regularly found elements like microplastics, inorganic chemicals. The conditions will nearly always corrode metals within a relatively short period of time, and its toxicity will be enough to kill almost anything. But as always, it varies. Some planets, for example, may be so large that they're in fact partly capable of handling the toxic output of hive cities, whereas others may exist in different strange conditions if the hives are, say, based on what would be largely an ocean world or an ice world and so on. However, by and large, having at least one section of your planet being a destroyed desert wasteland is one of the most common for hive worlds, which makes reasonable sense when you consider the effect of a huge population over time. This is one of the reasons why Terra is now an ecumenopolis. But it's very notable that for any PDF or Imperial Guard, having to defend your hive city while suffering the external environmental conditions is obviously not one that is particularly favourable to humans, and so even a modest assault upon a hive city can in fact be quite problematic. Human defenders suffering significant casualties just from the passive environmental conditions and temperatures alone, not to mention the effect that that can also have on their morale. Some wastelands surrounding a hive city may in fact be so dangerous that they're used as a form of capital punishment, be that based on the temperatures being so high that they just burn the skin off your body in minutes before suffering a full system collapse, or so cold that the result is near enough the same, just on the opposite end of the scale. Some wastelands, the material is so abrasive that again can blind you in moments and cut your flesh to ribbons. Other hive cities will be surrounded by a toxic smog of chemical pollutants that simply being thrown out into the wasteland will lead the condemned to either choke to death, or potentially far worse, those pollutants will attack the body and dissolve them into near enough from the inside out once the contaminants have entered the body. Likely though, the worst fate will be for those thrown out into hive cities surrounded by hundreds of miles of highly irradiated wasteland. Sometimes this can be mild and only be the result of past wars that has degraded over time, but in the more severe cases, some past immense disaster involving nuclear material has caused pockets of very extreme radiation to persist. For those who are forced out into these invisible minefields, they may initially think that they have escaped the worst, just being sent out into exile, not suffered some more brutal fate, but it will in fact not be long before they start to see their skin turning red, black, generally feeling very unwell, and within days their bone marrow will die, followed by the rest of their body essentially disintegrating. They're condemned to a very agonizing death, only comparable to the worst attentions of the chaos deity Nurgle. Although the most toxic areas of the waste tend to centre around a hive city for obvious reasons, beyond this the waste continues on for many thousands of miles, if not covering the entire planet itself in ashen deserts. While sadly the majority of the time this tends to be fairly typical for a world containing many multiple hive cities, certainly it's the norm for those containing hive clusters. Still, having said all of this, some wastes around a hive can strangely still contain life, albeit weird Xenos life, but life nonetheless. In the ashen wastes of some hive worlds, although more complex life is long extinct, you may still find basic algae, bacteria and fungi, although it's usually worth noting that these can in fact also be quite aggressive, and it's one of the reasons why those humans who choose to venture into the wastelands tend to be kept in hab areas separated from internal hive populations, dare they risk spreading some biological contamination. One of the most extreme dangers of being out in the wastes are of course the actual dust and ash storms themselves that ravage planets. Some hive cities have even been reported as having become nearly buried by the worst of these storms, and it's at least believed that some have also been and were lost long ago in their early periods of development because of this. These lost hives are now unable to be detected, having been buried so far underground. I like to imagine again there is the rarest outside possibility that even if the population long ago perished, there may be early hive cities containing a wide array still of Dark Age technology existing out there somewhere buried on a hive world waiting to be unearthed, even now below thousands of years worth of surface matter. For the current living members of hive cities though, ashen storms are dangerous, not just because they can be very disorientating for those who are able to, or simply must, work out in these conditions, but also because the storms themselves whip up all the deposited material, which as we already learned can be extremely dangerous just when it's lying on the ground. Being out without adequate protection in a wasteland storm can mean a person having their flesh literally stripped to the bone in minutes, leaving nothing but a bleached skeleton and the tattered rags that once covered them. Undoubtedly on some hive worlds this will again be a punishment in and of itself. No doubt you might see some sort of pillared structures dotting the wasteland around a hive city where the condemned are placed and left to be sandblasted back to a skeletal form that will then tumble into a pile of wasted bones below. The conditions are harsh enough that it may even be worse than that, and not even bone remains, every piece of you being stripped back to dust. Beyond the individual level though, ash storms on some worlds can in fact be a very serious threat, not just to these wayward individuals, but hive cities themselves. The conditions are extreme enough that it's been known for entire exterior sectors of hives, which are usually fairly well protected with reinforced materials, to have been stripped right down. And it has even been reported that some hives were compromised and destroyed by storms that whipped around the planet for centuries, culminating in a truly apocalyptic storm that wipes away anything in its path. On some hive worlds, the scrapped remains of the base or mid-levels of hives that have suffered such destruction are periodically revealed by the shifting oceans of ash, only to be hidden away again for many centuries. On some worlds, notably Necromunda being one of them, Imperial scholars believe that these wastes actually have currents and tides of other subsurface pollutants that rise from the planet's bedrock and form undercurrents that shift these wastes around like an ocean. In other areas where pollutants rise up and cover the surface, they can dry to form what appears to be a dried lake bed hard enough to travel over. But these are often dangerous environmental hazards because below the apparently secure surface is in fact a deep sea of ash and dust like a quicksand, and will swallow any who step out incorrectly onto the thinnest parts of these deceitful landscape features. Hive cities are of course fascinating in and of themselves in their design, wider purpose and historical development to have now become one of the primary locations for humanity's population by the end of the 41st millennium. However, as curious as they are just as a place, the far more interesting thing to learn about are the people who inhabit these vast spaces. And this is a topic which you could talk about extensively, so today I'll just be giving a flavoured overview, starting at the very top. Now, the Highborn are basically the elite ruling families of hive cities and just in general imperial worlds. They are decadent, wealthy, often crazed, and most certainly very disconnected from the reality for those living literally under them. They will breathe clean air, eat imported foods, holiday on lush, verdant paradise worlds, and want for very little. Most of the upper spire nobility will have been born into this life of luxury, and never having known anything different has led them to have extremely twisted concepts of humanity, ethics, and morals, and it's fair to say that they're generally not liked by many who serve the Imperium's larger causes. Their lives are very much comparable to that of ancient royalty because most of the time they're dealing with political intrigue, personal vendettas, campaigns of revenge, murder to gain positional status, marriage, illicit affairs, decadent parties, and any number of far worse offences that would likely be classed as heresy if they were discovered in the lower hive spire. They're usually self-obsessed, ignorant about the things that matter, and most of all hungry for power. All character flaws that are a triple threat red flag for the Inquisition, who will try their best to keep agents undercover within hive spires to hear just what they're getting up to. If there was ever to be a very fertile breeding ground for cults of Slaanesh and Tzeentch, hive spires would be the very place to look. Comparative to your average worker though, spire nobles will be relatively well educated about their own lineage, some history of the Imperium, but reminding them also that they are the finest examples of Imperial citizens, of course. They will learn about wealth, economics and trade, politics and power, not to mention continual personal tutoring by their families in the fine arts of social assassination, how to cut down an opponent with razor-sharp wit, how to lay a verbal trap to best slight your enemies in public, and so on. They're not all, of course, disgusting, spoiled brats. Some will have the wherewithal to pose as potential candidates even for the Inquisition and be able then to infiltrate other hive spires to report in on the goings-on to their masters. Some hive nobility will be directly tied also to the goings-on of a hive world, be it say a shrine world, mining operation, trade hub or Astra Militarum bastion. This will to a degree influence those within the hive spire, and they may be slightly less or slightly more corrupt and immoral as a result, and this will generally be relative to how under the lens of the Imperium they are. On a backwater mining world that just spews wealth from lucrative ore trading, things are probably going to get pretty nasty, but on an Imperial military bastion world it's going to be more difficult to keep your disgusting murderous campaigns against rival offspring or questionable trade deals out of sight. Now, the Underhive may also see the occasional appearance of what are known as Spirers. Now, as the name suggests, Spirers are upper hive noble members, usually younger peers who are sent to essentially prove themselves by eradicating some undesirable vermin. They will don highly advanced, possibly even Dark Age level hunting suits that are constructed off-world. The origin of these is unknown, although a fair guess from me would be that it involves Jakiro. Sometimes these suits are akin to something like an exosuit, and it provides these high levels of protection, firepower and camouflage as they engage in one of the most foul and decadent activities, human hunting. Hive nobles would tell you that this is a rite of passage and that besides it serves a purpose in eliminating the worst elements of a hive city. To a degree, this may well be true. However, it seems almost certain that there is a darker side to Spira hunting, and that within some hives it becomes more like a competitive sport and more than likely will involve excessive levels of gambling, potentially with even live video feeds being pumped back up into the high spire. By and large, the activities of Spiras are probably far more disturbing than just being some ancient occasional rite of passage. That may sound surprising, but various Space Marine chapters will in fact keep a form of structure on hive worlds that they believe hold either critical tactical importance or were just good for recruitment. Of course, their home planet is discounted here, as on that world they will be just everywhere, but on other hive worlds it may be something more just like a simple chapel, a keep, an outpost. It may not be permanently occupied either, but it will nearly always be placed at one of the very highest levels on the hive city's spire, because it's very rare that ordinary citizens would be able to catch a glimpse of these glorious Astartes coming and going. Now, as I think by now we have easily illustrated, for many ordinary human inhabitants of a hive, their existence is grim in the extreme. Conditions are harsh, and so is the work. Only those able to work will be granted accommodation and credits, and this is usually a very overcrowded accommodation, very unsanitary. Despite this, many mid-level workers are considered in fact to be lucky by those forced to exist in the lower factorum levels, because those lower level workers have never felt anything like a sun ray and will hold the open streets and spaces within the mid-levels to upper spire sections as in fact glorious places. And in fact it's reasonable to say that they are, because at least in comparison to the choices of the infinitely more polluted and violently dismal locations in the lower hive, you'd pick those upper areas every time. The best summary for workers and citizens is that their lives are fairly simple. They will grasp small pleasures where they can, they will try and have a family where they can, and put the majority of time in their work. They will give prayer and faith in the Emperor, likely attending regular services at the behest of the ecclesiarchy that are always patrolling the hive. They'll try to stay out of trouble, they'll try to make the odd black market deal here and there, they'll have some children, and then, like I say, probably an early death by the standards of anyone above the working class grade. Life in a hive is astonishingly comparable to the industrial period of old Earth, polluted, simple, often